Welcome back, everyone. Okay, so there's been a fair amount in the news about Sony and their relationship with Japan, which sounds like quite a funny thing considering that Sony is a Japanese company. But the big context there is that basically the power has shifted. So it's less Sony Japan, or PlayStation Japan making the big PlayStation decisions, and it's very much more the US side that are leading the whole PlayStation endeavor. Now, that has been great in a way, for loads of gamers who are enjoying a lot of the Western PlayStation stuff, those big blockbuster games that, of course, we've all heard of. But there's a lot of people who do love, well, the Japanese part of PlayStation. I mean, it's one of the things that made it very unique. And a bunch of things have happened, we're going to do a quick recap for you, that have rattled the confidence of those people. And while I must admit that's not really as much the side that I come from, because I did, when I was a kid, get a Xbox 360. I got a PS3 much later. Matt, you are a bit different. You're a PlayStation man.
Yep, this strikes very, very much to the heart of the games I very much enjoyed growing up on. A lot of that kind of crazy shit on the PS1, the PS2, you're like, well, where did that come from? Where did that go? And then, spend your entire late adolescence, adult life chasing it down, ending up in really deep, weird Japanese rabbit holes. And, you know how it goes. And then you find out that, PlayStation doesn't really, cater to you as much anymore.
Yeah, so to work that out then, let's do the quick recap of things. So, according to Video Games Chronicle sources, Sony shuttered Japan studio because their games were not profitable enough and did not have global appeal. Japan studio wanted to make Japanese market games that might break out of the Japanese market and be big hits in the West. They want to do that rather than focus on global first games, which I think if you were to read into that, Western-oriented blockbusters. Now, other sources claim that this is a part of PlayStation's ongoing shift of power from Japan to California, where PlayStation has actually been headquartered since 2016. Layoffs and restructuring has shifted the balance of PlayStation to being an American-led company rather than three independent wings, and that has changed the decision-making apparatus. Bloomberg has said that the Japanese market has been sidelined. Japanese niche games have been treated less favorably in recent years, with an obvious switch taking place. Nintendo are now the go-to platform for lots of Japanese market games, with Sony either cancelling or censoring games on their platforms. And the biggest precedent set here was, I think, something in principle, and that is the swapped control scheme, where the PS5 in all regions ships with X for confirm and O, or circle, for cancel, rather than the Japanese units, which traditionally had circle for confirm and X for cancel. That's not the biggest thing ever, but think about it. If you're a lifelong, Japanese PlayStation player, and it's PlayStation, a Japanese brand, and then it sort of switches to no longer be the norm for the Japanese market, you can see how that would feel a bit bad if you've been supporting that company for a long period of time. Then, a Japanese research firm said that Sony is not taking Japan seriously and that the PlayStation brand is in decisive decline there. However, we should say there have been some figures who have downplayed this, like Platinum Games' studio lead. However, he did imply that the market is shifting. So that essentially is our recap of things. So now to get to the actual news story. So Herman Hulst, speaking to Game Informer, continued to downplay the whole Sony abandoning Japan narrative, as Jim Ryan, who's the CEO of PlayStation, did before him. Quotes such as, "I will say that we are in some ways very much a Japanese company still. That's our heritage, that's still part of who we are. We love Japanese games. We're building out Team Asobi under Nicolas Duquet? Yeah. So we're actually investing in that team. People forget sometimes that we have Polyphony Digital, which is a team in 2 locations." Another quote, "We are still investigating our external development group out of Tokyo as well, and that's a team that has obviously worked with the likes of From Software and Kojima Productions." And then for the final quote, "So we are very invested in Japanese development, and Japanese development is something we love. I think it's such a core part of the PlayStation identity that I can't ever see us shy away from Japanese or even Asian development." Then, of course, as you point out, that lines up with what Jim Ryan has been saying SIE also has strong relationships with licenses in Japan, so we'll continue to strengthen our ties with them and develop titles made in Japan for PlayStation fans around the world. Some people would read into that. We have not been as excited about the engagement of the Japanese game development community as we are now for many years. So that's what's new. Then, what is the takeaway? Where you call out in this doc to pay close attention to the language, where Jim says, develop titles made in Japan for PlayStation fans around the world. And Herman saying that they're invested in Japanese development. So a lot of people are thinking they're supporting Japanese developers, but not necessarily Japanese market games. And that is a subtle difference, but it's one that's powerful for the Japanese market and for the PlayStation experience. And it's just that thing of like, the games are going to be greenlit. What are the experiences actually like? Where a lot of those Japanese market games just do feel different in a way that a lot of people in the West have liked for a long time. And they feel that PlayStation is no longer as focused on that particular game feel. Vibe, I suppose. So yeah, wide and global appeal in a small number of huge titles is exactly the trap the AAA fell into, and that resulted in basically a loss of creativity in the industry. I think most of us would agree there. And you say basically don't expect an Ape Escape remake anytime soon, or a new game that feels like Gravity Rush, or anything that feels drastically unique and exciting, at least not conceptually. And you call out that right now Sony first party has nothing announced from Japan except for Gran Turismo, which isn't much of a Japanese game, and feels like Western racing sim, I suppose. Can't say I've really played Gran Turismo games. The only ones I've done are Forza. Not that that's out of trying. And then the final thing here, I think just before we really dive into the discussion, is it all overblown? To the average person, this stuff probably doesn't matter a ton because Japanese publishers can do whatever they want and just publish it on PlayStation. And then also, PlayStation Studios do have a very high, quality bar that they do usually hit. So that PlayStation experience, like being a PlayStation owner, should still be a very good thing. Now, to a fan of niche Japanese titles, it's a betrayal of a long relationship between publisher and consumer. But you do say, to be fair, Sony are somewhat supporting Japanese development through Shuhei Yoshida's own internal initiative and supporting Marvelous's indie games incubator. You do have a counterpoint here saying Shu posted indie spotlights to the PlayStation blog, and it included Hades. Also, the only Japanese game there was Soul Cresta by Platinum. And you say, by the way, the indie scene is growing in Japan and PC gaming is taking off as well, which I think is certainly good news for everyone.
Yep.
And yeah, your final point, at this rate, Sony is handing Japan on a silver platter to Nintendo, Xbox, and PC. I believe we actually did a story maybe a few months ago about Xbox doing Sony doing still super well, because it still is selling a PlayStation in Japan, but not as well, perhaps, and Xbox going better than expected. I think it was mostly Microsoft kind of winning than it was PlayStation losing, but I guess just like given that Microsoft have always struggled in that market, and if you look at Games Pass, Yakuza, lots of really good Japanese games are just on Game Pass for everyone.
Yeah, that's one of the important things. It's the fact that they're handing it over.
Yeah.
Like, they're not defending it. They're not going, no, this is our market. We've traditionally, Nintendo have always had a very, very strong hand, but they're like, we're a premium console in Japan. We're going to stay here. They're just kind of going, Xbox are growing substantially. PlayStation's not. PlayStation isn't decisive decline, the Japanese report said.
That's not ideal, because the current population of Japan, I suppose it's an estimate from Worldometers, but that's 126 million people. It's quite a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. They've moved to this Western focus. They've not done anything for specifically the Japanese market, and that feels like a substantial betrayal. And I think that's most of the problem. But I take issue with the fact that they're talking about how, we're so Japanese. We're a Japanese company. We love Japan. No, I don't think anyone Japanese has spoken in an interview in a long time in general. I was looking to see if Shu had said anything, but there's no Japanese leadership generally on the Western side. They're not making any games. They have Team Asobi, who are working on something and upskilling, but that's because of Astro's Playroom, and that's because it's a new studio led by someone who isn't Japanese, which implies that they're kind of going, oh, we can make use of all these development resources, but we'll be doing it for the purpose of a global like release title.
Like, what are examples of games you like? Like the games that you're talking about that are like the ones you're worried are not going to be the sorts of things that are made as much in the future.
Like the ones that immediately come to mind are the stuff that Japan Studio's done. It's the stuff they've worked with. It's the fact that they were sitting there helping with Bloodborne and made that happen as a Sony exclusive. Well, that's not going to happen again. It's the older stuff like Ape Escape that's just kind of that fun era that PlayStation used to like be back in the day before the PS3 happened and everything went completely grim, dark, and apeshit. It's all of those older games, the stuff like the Parappa the Rapper, the Guitar Man, all of those like interesting things, but it's less about what games and franchises will lie dead, and substantially more about what creativity is going to be promoted by them. And it all kind of came to a point when I started thinking about the indie stuff.
Right.
Because I feel like Sony from 2001, 2003, something like that, would have ran around Japan grabbing all the indies they could, fed them full of money, and pumped out all those games. But you've got a growing scene in Japan of independent developers. There's BitSummit, there's that BitSummit conference where there's a load of indies get together, but they don't really have any outlet for stuff outside of PC. And that's the thing where it's like Shuhei, leading the indie initiative at PlayStation, has only talked about, well, there's Vita stuff he's talked about, but they've killed the Vita, dead now. Yeah. So that can't go any further. So they've kind of thrown all of those Japanese developers in the bin that were doing that. They've all just moved to the Switch because they have those
it's
like small
natural.
they have those small handheld stuff. Then you've got like he goes on to highlight independent games, and the only one that's Japanese is Platinum Games' Soul Cresta, and I don't think Platinum Games really need too much. They are technically independent, but they're a large studio, they don't need as much. And the other 6 were, Western indies that were exciting. Hades doesn't really need an awful lot of thing. That was more, this is on PS5 and PS4 next week, so please buy it.
Yeah.
It just doesn't feel like they're giving the support that in a better world, or in a world where they stuck to those principles of like what got them started in the West initially. Because obviously I understand it's a different time, but they just kind of don't have that same, they aren't supporting that market, they aren't supporting that burgeoning industry because they're too busy focused on Western AAA. I think that's largely the problem, especially when they're sitting saying, oh no, we're still Japanese, we have Polyphony Digital, who have 5 studios across the world, are making Gran Turismo, which, has a Japanese sort of ethic to it, and it's this really solid sim, but it's not a Japanese game, it's not a game for the Japanese market. Same with basically everything else they're making in the West. And even they have they expanded Sony XDev, which is the external development group they're talking about. They added some of those to like some of the staff there in Japan, but they ultimately are sitting working on mostly Western stuff, because XDev I think only helped with it was Returnal and a couple other of their first party published games that they helped with. But there's no movement in and around Japan despite that market being there. That's the kind of thing where it's fair because, Square Enix are doing a lot of good work with all those Japanese games, but it's that like the lower layer of the indies that aren't getting support, that where they should be getting support or would be getting support.
It's interesting. I've heard a bit about Sony trying to make amends.
Yeah.
With with indies and stuff. I mean, they did that indie spotlight.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Yeah. So we have to see what's coming out of that, and if that will include more of what's coming out from Japan.
Yeah.
I think with Sony, it's like whenever we had that story about a whole bunch of indie devs talking about how they really weren't happy with the PlayStation platform, and the more we dove into it, it seemed far less like it was malice from Sony's part, and it was more that they were just swamped with bizarre and ancient internal structures and systems where the likes of, like, say, Microsoft and Steam are quite a bit more self-service from the developers' end. So it's kind of like a whole bunch of those things were really bad and awful for the indies, but not necessarily because Sony big hated the indies or anything. I think it was just that they weren't super important to their strategy, therefore they maybe didn't invest in doing some of those things better. But I wonder if those things are to get better, what does that mean for Japanese indies, and could we sort of eventually see that going in a better direction? I mean, I'll be clear, Will it affect me personally? Basically, no. But I know there's a lot of people who, who could get a lot more enjoyment from a slightly different direction to what's seemingly been going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the I can't remember what game it was that was outright censored. I think it was Moero Chronicle or something, which is, bit grim, to be honest. I can sort of agree with, fair enough, you don't want that in Western hands, whatever, but it's the example of the Senran Kagura games, because Kenichiro Takagi? I can't remember. But,
basically, apparently
yeah.
Westerners are not big fans of life in hometown.
That's exactly it.
Seven people will get that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But it was the idea that he left his company because he was struggling with the demands or the requirements that Sony from like the American headquarters were putting on publishing their games. So he was having trouble, and what generally his games are harmful or harmless fun. Like, they're not particularly dark or anything. They're just, here's, women in bikinis fighting. You're like, fair, whatever opinion you might have, it's not particularly harmful. And he's just like, well, I can't make those games anymore because it's literally too difficult to deal with Sony. So he went off to work with, what are they called? Side games?
Yeah. On
something else entirely. And it just kind of feels like, for all of those fans, they're now left in the lurch. Or, I think the last two Senran Kagura games were published on the Switch.
Yeah.
So when Nintendo were going, well, that's harmless enough, come over here. But then Nintendo obviously aren't going to go and run around and give loads of money to like independent companies or anything like that to support an industry. They're very passive.
It was just very funny seeing Senran Kagura reflections on the family and sort of kid oriented company Nintendo's Switch console.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought that was funny for obvious reasons.
I mean, it is, yeah.
Yeah, it is just funny. And I think with the Saturn Kagura, did you not mention did he not say something about it was sort of he doesn't have as much of a desire to make like those things, and
that was significantly more recently than his whatever, because when he left Marvelous, it was because of that stuff. I believe very openly, and then he was working over at Side Games for a while, and then started saying he's maybe wised up a bit and doesn't want to do the kind of silly stuff. He wants to be a bit more serious as far as his work over there goes. So there's a little bit of like his own personal stuff there that happened, but it is also the case that he's like, well, Sony won't let me make the game I want. And I think the vast majority of people, including all the ratings boards, went, well, that's harmless. Slap a 15 or 16 on it because there's a bit of physics there, but sound.
Yeah.
Doesn't cause any actual harm. So whereas Sony are being, not my words, but people call Sony puritanical in how they go on now, which is very different to where they're just like, yep, have relative freedom.
If I was to sort of step back, because as you know, basically I was Western FPSs, Western RTSs, and World of Warcraft. That was kind of like most of my game. Total Wars and stuff. I think perhaps some of this is, there are ideas in, say, startup, sort of like startup culture of like, sometimes you have to fire your customers.
Yeah.
Because maybe that's not the sort of customer you want. Maybe that's not what's convenient to you. Or even in the example, if let's just say you're in a services firm and you've got that one customer who just takes up way too much time. Everything's too complex and it's really not worth it. So just fire that customer and that time and resources can go somewhere a bit better. I have to wonder from some of Sony's thinking, they know they're a Japanese brand. They know that's really important to their identity. So they want to reap all of the positive benefits of that. But then equally, they're like, these customers are not, they are a shrinking share of what we bring in, and they're not, in our opinion, the best look, considering that, we're doing advertisements, like literally advertisements for The Last of Us Part 2 that had my friggin' mum interested because she saw it on the TV.
Yeah.
And, probably was like, oh, what is this? Some Netflix thing? And then, oh, it's a video game. Okay, well, I can't do video games. But you can see how perhaps they would just see as they grow, that's less important. So in a way, it's maybe even what we covered in some of the previous Sony stuff of like, they're just being a little bit more cutthroat about doing what makes the most sense for them, but that's obviously going to make those customers who are left behind feel pretty bad about it. I think that's probably just what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, from the business perspective, I completely agree. It's well within their right to do whatever they want on that front. I think like whenever it comes to the stuff about more sensorial or censorious, I think that's, that's entirely within reason for them to do whatever. But it's the part that I think is the most loss for the video game industry is the fact that they seem to not be supporting the Japanese industry at a time where it could, not to say that it needs the support, because you've got Bandai Namco releasing 500 games every other day, and they're all, either reasonable or good. Maybe not Jump Force, but like games that are just being pumped out. I mean, like the Tales of Arise, that is getting significant leeway in the West, significant interest in the West, because basically, weebs in the West have exploded as a demographic, and Sony seem to want absolutely nothing to do with that, which is annoying because there's a whole host of Japanese development that they could be supporting and profiting from, but they're not, and it's like they would be perfectly positioned to boost that indie space massively, but they're clearly not paying attention there because they're focused on what they would rather do, which is, again, fair, but I feel like it's a lost opportunity for the video game industry.
And then your counter to that for Microsoft is that Microsoft knows they right now can't do the big blockbusters because while they probably do have an excellent development pipeline, it's just a bunch of stuff that is a little bit in the future. So they've been trying to hit via Game Pass a great value proposition for loads of different segments of the market.
Yeah.
That's why I think there's a Dragon Quest there, there's Yakuza, there's a lot of stuff. So maybe Microsoft have realized that if Sony are seeding some of these Western weebs, why don't we go get a few of them? So it makes sense for Microsoft.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, Game Pass advertisements with virtual YouTubers. You've got Bandai Namco games on there. You've got Sega games on there. You've got, what was the other major company? Well, Square Enix games on there as well.
I guess that says a lot. I mean, I'm not going to expect to, tomorrow come home and play FF14 on my Xbox.
Yeah.
That's on the PlayStation, of course, but it's interesting that just the amount of collabs.
Well, that's the thing.
Pretty big.
If FF14 were being developed today, it would likely, like Phantasy Star Online 2, Genesis, it would likely be, it'd be on Game Pass.
Forgot about Phantasy Star.
Yeah, it'd be on Game Pass, it'd be on PC. Sony'd probably let it on as well because, they have a relationship with the Final Fantasy series, but, going forward, I would expect Xbox to, knock on Square Enix's door and go, yo, that new Final Fantasy, we'll put a couple mil in, give us advertising rights or something like that.
Yeah.
And then consumers will be like, fuck it, if not got a PS5 anyway, might as well go get a Series X. There you go.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think there'll be a lot of this and just seeing what happens to those big Japanese franchises as time goes forward. I think we'll be able to read in between a few lines.
Yep.
But till then, I think at least people will understand the situation from a few different perspectives. And that was the goal of today's video. So hopefully goal achieved. If we did achieve our goal, let us know. If we didn't, also let us know. I think that's us. So thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.